Welcome to GTI Insights, GTI's newly launched podcast. I'm Marzia Borzoi-Kelly. I'm the program manager at the Global Taiwan Institute. I'm really delighted to have with us today J. Michael Cole. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm just going to give a little introductions, just a few highlights of his impressive bio before we dive into the podcast. So J. Michael Cole is a Taipei-based policy analyst and a senior non-resident fellow here with GTI. From 2014 to 2016, he worked at the Thinking Taiwan Foundation, which is a think tank founded by President Tsai Ing-wen, and you were there the chief editor. Prior to relocating to Taiwan in 2005, he was an intelligence officer with the Canadian Security Intelligence Services in Ottawa. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being with GTI Insights. It's a pleasure to have you here. So I would like to talk to you today about the implication of the Chinese Communist Party influence in the media and the election in Taiwan, especially since Taiwan is going to have presidential election in January of next year.
Right. Well, that's a question that is asked, that has been asked repeatedly in recent months. There were local elections in Taiwan in November last year, and already there were, many signs indicating that the Chinese were ramping up their influence operations, if you will, across the spectrum. So there was a large component of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, and whatnot. And of course, the more traditional means by which a country tries to influence the politics of another country. So moving money around, making promises to candidates that Beijing deems would be more willing to partner with Beijing in their goals of achieving unification with Taiwan. We have yet to fully assess the actual impact of those types of operations targeting Taiwan, whether it succeeded in swaying elections in certain areas, for example. But there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that Beijing learned lessons from those particular elections and will apply what it has learned from them in the lead up to the 2020 elections in January, which will be quite determinant, in my opinion, as to the future external policies of the Taiwanese government. So we're already seeing a ramping up of disinformation, computational propaganda. The entire media environment in Taiwan, social media and traditional media, is awash in disinformation right now. And it seems to be overwhelming consumers of news as well. So the government and civil society are looking for means by which to mitigate and counter that threat. But it is definitely a reality. And as I said, I maintain there is no doubt that that will be a factor in the coming elections.
And can you give us just some examples of, for example, like what type of influences, example on, some cases that came out in social media, and also how the Taiwan government, how the Taiwan government is trying to mitigate that?
Right. Well, one big challenge right now that all of us are facing, and certainly law enforcement and intelligence agencies in Taiwan are facing, is the point of origin for disinformation, for example. They have been tracking IP addresses that were clearly identified as being located physically in China, if you can call an IP address being located physically somewhere. But the problem is that these IP addresses tend to jump all over the place as well, and they've been identified as moving all over the world. But if you find the initial IP, then you can basically you can reverse engineer and say that it originated in China. That being said, a large amount of disinformation that we have seen in recent months also originates in Taiwan. So we don't want to claim that all of that, the huge volume of disinformation, is solely coming from China. Now, the big question is that disinformation being generated on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, or is it being done simply by people from the opposition camp, for example, or small civil society organizations or political parties in Taiwan that also are working towards unification? China Unification Promotion Party, the Taiwan Red Party, the New Party are three of the main registered parties that also are actively working with Beijing. These entities are also generating huge amounts of disinformation. There's a constellation of Facebook pages, for example, with signs of at least coordination, if not automation. They're all posting the same disinformation about the state of the economy, for example, and they're using memes like Guaida or Ghost Island to basically give the impression that under President Tsai Ing-wen, the economy has been tanking. If you look at the figures, the economy has not been tanking, and basic wages have been rising. Tourism has reached new levels and whatnot, but by dint of repetition and bombarding consumers on social media, on their Facebook pages and all that, with notions such as the economy is tanking, or a candidate like Han Kuo-yu, for example, the Kaohsiung mayor, would be the sole candidate who has the knowledge or wherewithal or desire to rebuild Taiwan's economy, for example. Combine that with traditional TV channels that also seem to be at least reflecting Beijing's wishes, and are all presenting very flattering image with regards to Han Kuo-yu, and then very critical reporting on other candidates. Also suggests some sort of coordination with certain elements who may or may not be willingly working with Beijing. I'm very reluctant to point fingers at any organization or individuals, because that is the job of law enforcement. They have access, and intelligence obviously, they have access to the classified material with which they can build a case against certain entities or media. Right now there is an accumulation of circumstantial evidence. It's reasonable to suggest that there is a large number of such agencies or individuals who are involved. Is it airtight? Is it something that I would bring to court to make a case against them? We're not exactly there yet. That will take time, and as I said, you need a fusion of law enforcement, intelligence, and government on one side, and open source journalism, investigators, academics, and then you need to bring these together and then build your cases against individuals. But if you ask for specific incidents, there was one, I believe it was last year, when there was a natural catastrophe and heavy flooding in Japan. And Chinese, the IP address was tracked in China, and the claim was that the Taiwanese government, based in Japan, had failed to intervene properly to save lives and evacuate Taiwanese nationals, and that conversely, the Chinese government had been able to, mobilize buses to evacuate people, and any Taiwanese nationals who agreed to say that he or she was a Chinese citizen. It turns out it was completely bogus, and that it was actually the Japanese government that mobilized these buses. Anyway, this snowballed into heavy criticism targeting the Taiwanese representative office in Tokyo, and led ultimately, and very sadly, to the suicide of one of the Taiwanese representatives. It's believed to be, as according to Japanese media, he committed that act because he felt embattled, he felt under attack, and heavily criticized. And so this is one instance where you have clearly disinformation that is clearly linked to China, that has led to real consequences back home in Taiwan. So I think that's one example that's been quite publicized as well.
Yeah, it's a very unfortunate example. And as you mentioned, with the IP addresses also, I guess it's hard, as you mentioned, to determine where they're coming from or the intent. Can you also just briefly tell our viewers the difference then between disinformation and misinformation in this case?
Okay, right.
What we're talking about.
There's a bit of a nuance, and people oftentimes interchangeably use these terms as well. My definition would be that disinformation is something that is generated with a clear intent of spreading something that is completely false. So basically, the term that unfortunately has gotten quite current is fake news. Okay. There's several reasons to disagree with the usage of the term fake news, but anyway, it has become a meme worldwide. Misinformation is a spin or a spin-off on an actual piece of information, but to which you add certain elements that are not exactly true. Okay. And both of them combined, are aimed at sowing confusion and basically undermining belief in in objective truth within society and government.
So the main difference is then the intent, because this information has the actual intent to lead the reader astray.
Exactly. Right.
Okay. So can you give us a little bit of an idea of what you think then, like the implication could be also for the United States? Taiwan is going to have presidential election in January 2020. We are going to have our own presidential election next year in November 2020. And obviously, as you just mentioned, fake news, it's kind of unfortunately spreading throughout the world. What can we learn from Taiwan and from what's going on in Taiwan?
Right. Well, I think we've reached a point where everybody can learn from everybody. The notion that the world can, or democracies can learn from Taiwan has some truth to it, because obviously Taiwan is the key target of Chinese active measures or influence operations, including misinformation, disinformation, and cyber warfare, computational propaganda, and all that. The problem for Taiwan is that, notwithstanding the many years it has been facing that kind of threat, they still haven't arrived at a point where they know how to counter these active measures. They're still in the phase, like every country worldwide, they're still in the phase where they are trying to identify the sources of such measures, track their origin, understand the mechanisms by which they are generated and being spread across the media spectrum. But in terms of learning from Taiwan on how to counter or mitigate these measures, you can learn a few things, but the problem is that the Taiwanese themselves are still trying to figure out how to deal with this. The government has already, or legislators have already proposed certain amendments to regulations that would allow them to crack down on sources of disinformation. The problem with that is that it's a very problematic proposition, because it can very quickly lead to a slippery slope, in that you have to ask yourself the question, which individuals or agencies should be tasked with determining what constitutes the truth and what is disinformation or misinformation. There's room for abuse should you have the wrong individuals being given those types of powers. This has repercussions for freedom of the press, freedom of expression. In a democracy, these are questions that cannot be taken lightly. And this is the same processes and same questions that other democracies worldwide are currently asking themselves. But that being said, I think, and I'm seeing clear signs that this is happening now, there is a coming together of democracies that have been facing that kind of threat. I think 2016 elections in the United States were a wake-up call. And if we remember, even U.S. intelligence, it took them quite a bit of time before they started realizing that social media and the Russian uses of social media were having an impact on the elections. So you cannot expect smaller countries to arrive at better conclusions faster, right? But there is a lot of exchanges right now behind closed doors, and also in open settings between decision makers and academics and even journalists discussing media literacy, for example.
That's important.
And Taiwan has very much been proactively seeking out that kind of engagement with partners. So hopefully at some point we will arrive at real conclusions and know how to deal with that challenge, but we're just not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully, like you mentioned, with the 2016 election in the U.S. and the one in Europe recently, also the European Parliament in Australia as well had election. These are all democracies that have witnessed and are experiencing different type of influences that we can learn from each other. And just like the U.S. and Taiwan are working along with the GCTF on different issue, that hopefully through that platform and even like expanding it to other democracies like we have with Japan already, and maybe expanding even more, we can tackle this important issue of disinformation, so that among democracy we can learn from each other, we can share experiences, and we can go stronger and ensure that democracy prevail at the end of the day. So, do you want to leave our viewers with any last thoughts?
Well, as I said, I think now we finally know who the candidate will be for the DPP. So it's going to be President Tsai running for re-election. As I said, given the what's at stake right now and how Beijing under Xi Jinping has been intensifying its campaign against Taiwan on different levels, and certainly on the influence operations level, and the area of potential candidates from the blue camp. Including certain individuals who are, in my opinion, outliers within the Taiwanese body politics and even outliers within the KMT itself. There are real risks that real serious damage could be caused to Taiwan's democracy. And I think that Taiwan will need resilience and strength in how it handles the upcoming elections. And this year, the lead up to the elections is going to be very exciting. It's going to be very dramatic. And I think we're going to start seeing things that we've probably not seen before in elections. So I think in that context, Taiwan will need all the support and help that it can get from other democracies and obviously the United States in trying to counter some of those external nefarious influences that could undermine democratic institutions in Taiwan. So what I want to leave our watchers with is basically stay tuned, and I think 2019 and 2020 are going to be exciting years in Taiwan and quite determinant for the kind of Taiwan that we can expect to interact with from 2020 onwards.
Also, that's the hope that democracy will prevail, and then we can continue working with Taiwan to, ensure that happens. So thank you so much for being with us. We hope to see you again on GTI Insights.
My great pleasure.
And then to our viewers, please stay tuned for more episodes. Thank you.